Hello and welcome! I'm DDF Racer, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the brand new visual improvements in RaceRoom's latest update. Now, just to manage some of those expectations before we go any further, this isn't a brand new graphics engine, which I'm sure many of you were hoping for. No, this is an enhancement to the existing graphics engine that RaceRoom uses, which still does, yes, run on DirectX 9 and all of the limitations that come along with it. However, that doesn't mean that what KW Studios have done here is insignificant. Quite the opposite. With some clever and incredibly technical wizardry, they've not only been able to make some fundamental improvements to the way that light sources and shadows are handled, they've removed a lot of the old, distracting and archaic visual artifacts from things like motion blur, depth of field, and texture flickering, all whilst adding new features such as customizable cloud cover, which changes with time progression, and actually improving the performance of the game with more frames per second in like-for-like scenarios, particularly when there's plenty of cars on track. And it also looks and works great in VR too, which is a big positive for me personally. I'm sure those of you who've been campaigning for years for things like a more modern version of DirectX, day-night transitions, rain, driver swaps, and so on, will continue to be disappointed, and I'll admit it as well, it would be nice to have those features in RaceRoom to bring it kicking and screaming into the modern era of sim racing. But for those who actually enjoy RaceRoom for what it is, with the vast range of content and the actual driving experience, the awesome physics and force feedback, and also the solid multiplayer netcode, these visual and performance boosts are a very welcome, if long overdue, bonus. Now, this isn't just a fancy reshade plugin or a post-processing filter that's being applied, as some people may have been suggesting on the comments on the official RaceRoom YouTube channel. No, these are fundamental changes to the way that the game works from the ground up, so let's dig in and take a closer look at the specifics. Ambient lighting has been completely overhauled, with not just the cars, but also the track and the surrounding objects and terrain reflecting and absorbing light in a much more realistic manner. Previously, the image could look a little bit flat and washed out, whereas now the time of day and the cloud cover, which is now a customizable setting per session, directly affects the kind of sunlight you get and allows for a much wider variation of lighting conditions, with a little help from the new auto exposure feature, but more on that later. This means that lights actually look like lights now, which kind of sounds like a stupid thing to say, but previously they were not that noticeable, almost baked into the car texture itself. Now, there's a brightness and a glow which just wasn't there before. When the car ahead of you gets on the anchors, it's much more noticeable, even in fully bright daytime conditions, although it's really noticeable when it's cloudy or overcast and the general ambient lighting is lower. Those brake lights pop so much more than before, and it's the same for headlights too, although you're only really going to notice this if you're watching back replays in the trackside cameras, or you've got a crazy AI flashing you in the mirror. Speaking of which though, the button assignment for lights now turns them on and off instead of flashing them like before. Although you still can flash your lights if you want by holding down this button instead of just pressing it once to toggle them. Motion blur on the edge of the screen is now much better too. Previously, there was this strange artifact, particularly noticeable on the tarmac, which would develop these odd, grainy lines and get worse and worse as the speed increased, and well, now it's gone. Previously, I would only use motion blur when recording trackside footage from replays, as this effect would also happen in the cockpit too, with all of the periphery getting blurred into oblivion, but now it's much better. You don't get that weird tunnel vision effect happening at high speeds, and it actually looks really nice in car now with the motion blur, as you can retain that image clarity that you need to spot all your markers effectively, but maintaining that sense of speed. Also, let's take a little moment to appreciate the subtle bump in the quality of the mirror, or in this case with the Mazda DPI, the rear-facing camera. It's not much, but it definitely adds to the immersion, which is what these changes are all about, in that nothing itself is a massive change, but cumulatively when you put them all together, it makes a huge difference. By the way, here's a comparison of what the mirror looks like on different settings, which, according to the patch notes, can be an easy win if you're looking to turn something down in the settings and boost your frame rates with minimal impact. As you can see, there's not much of a difference, and to be fair, you probably won't even notice that much unless you're the kind of person who spends the entire race looking in their mirrors. And hey, having raced Brody Steen for years, I get it. There was also previously a flickering in the motion blur when the shadows interacted with them too, which is now gone. Particularly at high speed, they used to jump around a fair amount and conflict with the blur, which would just result in this super jittery and distracting effect, which, as you can see, yeah, just just not there. And this shot also highlights the difference in the glass reflections, which are much crisper, but to be fair, only a small part of the overall changes to the car material system. This shot is probably a way better example of highlighting these car material improvements, and yeah, it might be subtle, but previously most cars had a reflective shine over the top of them regardless of what the paint was, whereas now liveries should react much more believably to the new lighting depending on whether they're matte, metallic, glossy, chrome, or a combination of these. There's also another couple of things happening in this shot which may fly under the radar at first glance. Check out the side panels being lit up by the exhaust flames. It's much more noticeable, and it turns out that it's not just headlights and brake lights that pop more. Backfires are affected too, as well as glowing brakes, which is pretty cool. Also, check out the tyres. Notice the new look on the rubber? I mean, even that's different now thanks to the new material system. When you first come out of the pits, you get that nice, shiny, fresh out of the mold thing going on, which gradually gets scuffed as you drive, although I haven't had a proper chance to check if heavy tyre wear or flat spots affects the textures here yet, so you guys are going to have to run some long stints and let me know in the comments. The way the sidewalls stay shiny is a nice touch though, and the motion blur which I previously mentioned also makes the tyre branding and all the text on the sidewall look a lot nicer at high speed too. Shadows are another massive area of improvement in this update, as they're much cleaner now and they've got less of that blocky pixel thing going on, but they're also visible at longer distances and blend in much more smoothly at lower angles, particularly noticeable at sunrise or sunset when those shadows are naturally going to be much longer anyway. Previously, shadows would be one of the first things you'd sacrifice in the settings when you try and get more performance and try and get RaceRim to run more smoothly, particularly in VR, so personally I'd often be running them at lowest or low, but now it's quite possible to turn them on at high or even ultra, which makes a massive difference to the immersion. And the way that the objects themselves cast shadows has been overhauled as well. For all of the footage in this video, I'm actually using the exact same replay file. I just recorded it before the update and after the update, so it's the same time of day, it's the same track, the same movements, the same cars, and you can really see how different it is. And this shot also really highlights well the lighting changes reacting to the track surface, the tarmac, the rubber buildup. I just think it looks fantastic, it really does. And for the most part, the new auto exposure feature is pretty good as well, as it adjusts to compensate for when it gets too dark or too bright, to take advantage of this new dynamic lighting. Instead of just being pretty flat like before, you now really get a sense of when some clouds roll in and it gets dark, or when the sun pokes out from between the trees and blinds you a little bit. The amount of auto exposure can be adjusted to your liking in the settings menu, so have a play around and see what works best for you. Although from my testing so far, the auto exposure doesn't really work too well in VR, and I'm probably going to turn it all the way down, maybe even off, when I'm running in my headset. On a standard monitor where your viewpoint is fixed, such as in the cockpit looking dead ahead all of the time, it's probably fine to bump it up a little bit, but when you're in VR and you start moving your head around, often most of the time without even realizing as you're leaning through the corners, the auto exposure becomes super noticeable. Dipping your head slightly and putting more dark areas into view, such as the steering wheel and the surrounding cockpit interior, will darken the whole image in general, and this causes the auto exposure to kick in and to compensate, which in turn brightens the image and causes the sky to blow out and become overexposed. It's not great, it's a bit distracting, so yeah, I'm probably going to turn this off in VR. Depth of field is also another area which has seen some love in this latest update, with the blurring and softening of distant out-of-focus objects being much smoother now and way more natural looking. In my opinion, this effect really draws your attention to what's in focus much more effectively now and makes it pop, for want of a better word. Take for example this sign in the foreground. Previously it was in focus and you could read the writing and it just kind of looked wrong without being able to put your finger on it exactly, but now it's in the foreground, it's not the center of attention, and it's nicely blurred out, which is a lot more realistic, and it just adds to the overall image and the realism of what's being displayed. Now that said, this isn't really something that'll be super noticeable when you're in the cockpit. I mean, I personally don't enable the depth of field effect while I'm driving, but for those trackside cameras and action shots, it looks super nice. And something else that this series of shots shows quite well is the way the motion blur now also doesn't kick in between camera shots. Previously, when RaceRim switched between cameras quickly, there were 1 or 2 frames in between where the motion blur just went crazy and had this kind of weird, warped, like almost psychedelic looking effect, as you can see from just skipping backwards and forwards in these frames here. Now, you probably didn't notice it, and obviously you're not going to see it now because it doesn't exist anymore in this update, but it was one of those things that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it, and every time a camera changed, there'd just be this kind of jarring flash in between, which I'm so glad they've got rid of this. Also, the overall color balancing has been completely refined, which you've probably already noticed by now. There's much less of that faded out bluish kind of look, which the old Raceroom graphics were known for and could seem quite cold and bright, almost a little too clinical at times, and kind of the opposite of what iRacing is known for, going in completely the opposite direction with having too much of a warmish yellow tint. It's a delicate balance to find, and it's something that is highly subjective. The sweet spot's obviously going to be different for everybody, but in my opinion, I think that Raceroom now does a really good job in terms of color balance and contrast, and just giving you an image that is quite believable. Another bug that's been squashed is flickering textures, particularly white lines, tire marks, grid spots, and so on. Previously, there might have been two textures on top of, or at least very close to each other, which, when zoomed in on from a distance, would flicker and glisten in a very distracting way. You may have seen this referred to as Z-fighting because, well, the two textures are fighting to be displayed, and they end up flickering between one another because they can't decide which one should be displayed on top. It was incredibly distracting and also immersion breaking, but now, for the most part, it's gone. Now, all of these visual improvements are all well and good, but probably the most impressive thing about this latest Raceroom update is the fact that you can get all of this new eye candy, all of these new improvements, but somehow the game actually runs better than before. Normally when you turn up the visuals and add in all these fancy new features and basically crank the settings is what we've done here, it comes at a bit of a performance hit with less frames per second, but no, not here. Thanks to better utilization of the CPU, there's actually a big performance boost, especially with a lot of cars on track. Now, I'm running an RTX 3080 10GB graphics card, a Ryzen 5800X 3D CPU, and 32 megs of DDR4 RAM, which admittedly is a decent build to begin with, but even with all of that, I'm still noticing massively improved frame rates, even with all of these new settings whacked up to the maximum. As you can see, there's a minimum a 20 frames a second increase, which is amazing considering this is the first lap of a race at sunrise, surrounded by 40 AI cars, and when the traffic thins out a bit later in the lap and there's less cars to render in the immediate vicinity, that goes up even more. I mean, I'm comfortably getting above 120, 140 now, which is it's more than enough. And the good thing is that even in VR these performance improvements carry over. I can run these exact same maxed out settings and still maintain a solid 90 frames a second on my admittedly rather old Oculus CV1, although that is in a practice session, and in a race I do need to turn the shadows and the visible cars down a bit to maintain that, but that's still a massive improvement on what I was doing before, where the shadows would be on lowest or even off completely. Honestly, this is huge for VR. Now, a quick side note regarding the new DKVX launch option, by the way, which, without going into the technicalities of it, is essentially a workaround that bypasses DirectX 9, kind of, and starts the game using Vulkan instead, offering even more potentially massive performance gains, especially with lots of cars on track. If you can get it working, which I couldn't. Well, technically I could, but only in full screen mode, not borderless windowed, which is why I need to record all of my footage and have all of my apps on the side of the screen without them disappearing when I'm doing my streams and stuff. Raceroom loads fine initially in DKVX, but as soon as I try to switch from full screen to borderless windowed in the display options, it freezes and crashes to the desktop. So if anybody knows how to fix that, please let me know. Anyway, there's also the brand new DTM 1995 pack, which was released at the same time as this update, and that features a couple of awesome new cars and circuits, including historic Hockenheim, which is like one of my all-time favorites, but I think I might leave that for another video because as far as the visual improvement side of things go, that's pretty much it. I'm keen to know what you think of this latest Raceroom update and whether you think it looks better or whether you preferred the old way, so let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you want to see more Raceroom, then make sure you subscribe to the channel because I've got a feeling I'm going to be spending a lot more time in it in the near future. And as always, thanks for watching.